Hello and welcome to Of Significance, the statistics podcast that for some people reads as an action comedy and others as sci-fi horror. I'm your every person host, Brent Buckwright here. The Oscars were on Sunday, March 2nd, and America got to watch the awards ceremony of our number 4 cultural export after all-you-can-eat buffets, Blue Jeans and Dolly Parton. Adrian Brody had the longest acceptance speech in history by anyone for anything. Conan O'Brien crushed it as the best host in years, and The Substance was snubbed, even though it was the best and only nominated movie I watched last year. But what this awards ceremony had me wondering was, what is the value of the awards? How important are they for the studios to get? And who in this whole process is actually getting robbed? So to talk about all of these things and more, our very own econometric celebrities, they're executive producers on the movie Regression to the Mean Girls, Bayesian Rhapsody, The Residuals of the Lost Ark, and 10 Things I Hate About P-Values. It's Doctors Nathan Woods and Steve Bronars. Steve, Nathan, how are you?
Doing great, Brent. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Did you guys get excited for this award season? Do you think you're more appreciative of the fashion, or is it just seeing the celebrities together that gets you the most excited?
For me, it's the fashion, 100%.
Really? Yeah. I was pretty excited this award season, but you said you only watched one of like the 9 movies that were nominated for Best Picture.
Yeah.
I haven't really seen them, so I know who the stars are, but I'm less familiar with what the movies are about.
I feel like watching the nominated movies is like flossing. Like as you get closer and closer to the appointment day, you feel like you should have done more by now, and you just never really prepare.
Well, that sounds right. And in our case, we never actually got to the flossing at all.
So we couldn't have a conversation about the movies without returning guest Sushrut Jain. He's a testifying expert with over 2 decades of experience analyzing antitrust, intellectual property, and consumer protection damages. But importantly for us, he's also quite possibly the only testifying economist who has also written and directed feature-length films. Welcome back, Sush.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So you directed Beyond All Boundaries, a documentary about the passion for cricket in India, and the feature-length film The Tenant, which stars a famous Indian movie star, and it'll soon be on digital platforms that people can watch at home. My first question for you is, how have you found the time to direct 2 movies?
Well, all of that happened when I had taken a break from consulting. So I took a few years off, went to film school, and spent a few years writing and making films. Also, this was before I had a kid. I can't even imagine doing any of these things now. But yeah, that's how I made the time.
Beyond All Boundaries is very interesting because it follows 3 stories of what I can really describe as characters in India who are obsessed with the game of cricket. How did you find these people, and what did you take away from their perspective on this game that is so popular?
Yeah. So, I'm an economist first. And when I started making films, I approached them from the point of view of an economist, thinking about this billion-person country. And I started thinking, what is one thing that I can use to sort of tie it all together and tell stories of people in India that would sort of connect everybody. And, the biggest source of entertainment in terms of money spent in India is cricket. It's the sport of cricket. The entire country is obsessed with it. So I thought, hey, there's a World Cup of cricket that was happening that year. This is back in 2011. It was happening in India. And the Indian team was actually kind of the favorite going in. So I thought, why not get there? The event goes on for like 2 months almost, and the entire country is going to be nuts. So use that as an opportunity to then get into the individual stories of, there's so many interesting people all over the country. So just find the right ones and tell their stories. And so in this particular film, I followed 3 people. One of them was this guy who is this sort of super fan who is dirt poor, has no job, has no family, but all he does every day is get on a bicycle and ride from one city in India to another, sometimes taking him days, sometimes weeks, to go to India cricket matches. And he was planning to do that during the World Cup. So I thought, hey, this will be amazing. I'll follow him. I'll see the country, and we'll tell the story of this insane guy, basically, who turned out to be a really charming person, and whose life sort of was a great window into modern Indian life. So that was one guy, and then the other two were, there was a 12-year-old prodigy who we had heard about, who everyone in India, or at least in Mumbai, was talking about. He would be the next big thing, sort of like the LeBron James of cricket, when LeBron was in high school. So we started, got permission from him and started following his career and his training and his life. And the third one, I really wanted to get women's stories into the film. And so we found a group of girls who were training to be on the Mumbai cricket team. And we started following one of them who basically lived in a slum. And she and her mother gave us access to their life, to their story, and sort of just the difficulty of, the dream that she was pursuing. And that became the third story. So that's what the movie's about.
If you were going to adapt that movie to Steve Bronar's, would he be going to different offices around our 12th floor here and offering people statistical advice? Would his face be painted? How would that work?
So yeah, you can't have a shirt on like this guy didn't, and you have to be on a bicycle.
That would not be good.
So that would be your version, I guess.
I'd love to see Steve biking up and down an elevator.
Yeah.
So getting to the award ceremony itself, there's an entertainment value to the Oscars that you can just watch it and enjoy. And I think in recent decades, they've gotten more criticism for being self-serving and a little bit outdated. But it's obviously clearly important to the artists and creators to get these awards. And if I was imagining my classic Econ 101 rational actor, forgive the pun, there would be a financial incentive to getting this coveted award. Otherwise, why pursue it? Do we see anything in the math play out that the award actually makes people money, or is it all prestige?
So I think there is a lot of support for the idea that these awards make a difference to the bottom line for the studios, especially. So Steve has more information on this, I know, but I can just give you anecdotal examples, and there is a long history of movies that were doing somewhat poorly in the box office in the run-up to the Oscars, then surprised everybody with a bunch of wins, and their fortunes changed overnight. This tends to be the case with mostly foreign films. So you can go back to Slumdog Millionaire. I think it was in 2008, 2009. And the movie was sort of unheard. Nobody really knew about it. It had a decent box office of I think 40 million or something like that before the Oscars, and won 8 Oscars. It was a huge winner. And the movie ended up just blowing up at the box office after that. And I think it ended up with almost 400 million in worldwide box office. And I mean, the relationship there is clear. It had to do with the Oscars. Many other films from other countries have had that same path. Parasite, more recently, 1917 was another one just a few years ago that had the same sort of story. The Oscars giving it a huge boost.
So, I mean, in that case, it seems like the Oscars are best served for relatively smaller budget films who need free advertising.
Yeah, it's the best free advertising that you can get is just purely, ideally it is driven by the quality of the film that just sways these voters in the Academy and then changes the fortunes of the film. It's not essential, obviously, for the Avengers 9 or whatever. So,
Brent, I looked at the data a little bit, and it's an interesting thing to try to study what that would be systematically, because I think what Sush is bringing up is one kind of heterogeneity across the different movies, where some of them might get more of a bump than others. And so I think even if you go back in time when box office was the main way in which you were going to be making money, some of the movies had been out quite a while by the time the Oscars telecast occurs and they announce who wins the awards, and they might be expected to get a different bump than movies where maybe they hadn't been around quite as long. They all have to be around at least for a few months, but that could matter. I think some of the things that Sush was talking about. So I think it would be hard to say there was a across the board always the same effect, but I do think when you look at the data, that impact has gotten smaller over time because I think there are just more ways in which a movie can be viewed and make money rather than just looking at the box office, which is the only kind of data that I looked at, which is like daily box office amounts for the different movies over time. And you do see some of these patterns that Sush is talking about, but it's definitely not the same thing for every movie. And I do think it's gotten a little bit less focused on box office return in recent years compared to what it would have been 30 years ago.
I would add to what you're saying is that, I think the original intention of something like an award show like this is you're kind of looking back at the year that has passed and you're sort of applauding the industry and each other for a good job done. It's not so much meant to have an impact going into the future. The examples I talked about were more sort of they were actually, I would say, the outliers, which stand out. But for the most part, it is what Steve is saying, that some of the movies, at least in the past, would have been out already for almost a year before that, award is given to them. But the impact is it still has an economic impact, maybe not on that film, but on that set of people that were involved, right? So specifically, most clearly on the stars and the directors and the writers and their futures going forward. But then also the studio itself, there's a lot of cachet that comes from winning that then gets you the opportunity to be part of better teams going forward.
Right. Because, and maybe people aren't fully aware of this, but to make a movie, it requires a bunch of investors, and investors need to know that their movie is going to be making a return on their investment. So it's got to be better than whatever the market or like an index fund would possibly return.
Exactly.
So if you're able to say our studio is able to produce Oscars and have that social notoriety, you're able to maybe shift some of the burden from having a financial return to having the social value of, yeah, I helped produce this prestige drama or whatever it was that gave you the award. I'm kind of curious about what you were saying, Steve, when it comes to the box office. Are there statistical analyses that I'm sure there are people who have done studies that try and look at what the dollar value return of an award may be? But I guess I'm curious about, on a more fundamental level, there can be an extraordinarily high return to getting the award, especially the award for Best Picture, or maybe even the Best Actor or Actress. And I'm kind of wondering if they're, because they're such rare events that maybe they don't make sense to study statistically in the same way, that almost just thinking about the expected value of putting an effort into getting an award is more important than trying to understand what the average value of that award is. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think like we said, for the most part, these award shows tend to be looking back at films that have already had their box office run. So the impact is not always, it's not expected to be on those particular films necessarily, except in those exceptional cases that I just mentioned. So really the impact is going forward on these awards end up making new stars, not just the movie stars, but also the stars behind the scenes, like the writers and the directors and the costume people and so on, and sort of puts them on different trajectories going forward, and gives them opportunities to make better films, and again, affects the studio's bottom line maybe on future projects.
And I think that it's possible that just being nominated would have an effect too, and that's obviously they're going to be, 5 times as many, now even more times as many movies that are going to be recognized in that way. And I think it's free publicity, and back when they used to advertise movies in the theaters, in newspapers, there'd be the big ad, and they would have like a picture like of the Oscars and say nominated for like 5 different Academy Awards. And there have been a lot of movies that have been pretty successful that were nominated for quite a few. It might have helped them, but they didn't actually win any because it's pretty hard to win. Like you're saying, it's a pretty rare event, Brent. So maybe there's an effect. But I agree 100% with Sush, which is that when you're looking at the return, that's a forward-looking thing. And so it's probably your next project. The next time you want to go out and raise money, you have a track record of producing something that is being recognized critically.
So if I'm a consumer of movies and I'm just a lay person and maybe not someone who's as interested in the filmmaking process, I might not be thinking necessarily about the studio and what they're producing. If I'm on the studio side, how can I expect to get that person to come watch my next movie if they're not thinking about me being the producer for this one?
I think it is the cachet, and then the fact that if you were a studio that was successful with a film in terms of winning awards, then the best actors in the industry and the best writers and the best directors want to be a part of that team going forward. So people are going to bring good material to that studio because it's going to develop a reputation. So it's a reputation effect kind of thing more than anything. But it's more indirect for sure than it is. I don't think you can draw a straight line from winning X number of Oscars to having X amount of revenue the next year, right? It's more fuzzy.
Brent, I think what you're saying is that, there are different things that they're looking for. Like Jerry Bruckheimer, he makes some fine movies. Now, he makes some very successful movies in one dimension. They make a lot of money, right? And he's got a particular reputation. I think that the way in which these award ceremonies work, I think we're talking about the Oscars in particular, they're not really recognizing exactly that kind of movie. So I think that some of the things the studios want to do is make movies that make a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
And that may have very little to do with who's going to win the Oscar. I think, Anora was like one of the lowest revenue, box office revenue movies ever to win Best Picture. $15 million is all it had made up to that point. I think there were a couple others that were lower, but that was kind of streaming and during the pandemic. So I don't know. I think the studios, obviously they want to win awards, but they have like a whole portfolio of films that they're investing in. And I think they want them to make money. Right, Sush? I mean, that's got to be what's motivating them, really.
I was actually curious. I remember Steve talking to you about this, and we were trying to look at the top 10 grossing films each year and sort of the relationship between those and how many of those won Oscars or any kind of award. And I was just curious if you had that handy.
I know how many were nominated, and back in the 70s, it was like 1 out of 4 of the top 10 movies would be nominated for Best Picture. They didn't always win, because back then, the one that really stuck out to me was The Towering Inferno,
right?
Which was like a bunch of like movie stars past their prime that got together for a disaster pick.
Steve McQueen.
Yeah, right. And I don't know. I actually don't know who was in the movie. I've never seen the movie, but I'm aware of it. And then
Steve Bronar's aware of movies.
Aware of the movie.
Never past his prime.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not really something you see on streaming that much, The Towering Inferno, but and that percentage has gone down over time. It was more like in the 80s and 90s, it was more like 15% rather than 25%. And now it's below 10%. So if you, what do I mean? I mean, like maybe 1 out of the top 10, Dune 2 or something like that, grossing movies, Wicked, things like that, in a typical year would get nominated for Best Picture. And so that correlation, that relationship between movies that make a lot of money at the box office and movies that are critically recognized I think it's weaker than it's ever been.
Do you think it's a result of the fact that there's just a lot more movies now? So whereas the number of movies that are going to get nominated for Best Picture are so few. So in the past, if it was just the same 50 movies or whatever that were coming out of the studio, there was a very high chance that, a bunch of them are they're going to fall into both camps. They're going to be nominated as well as be highly grossing. Whereas now there's a kind of movie that's made that's meant to be highly grossing. And then there's a totally different kind of movie that's made that's meant to win awards.
I think that is a reasonable part of the explanation, but starting about 15 years ago, they essentially doubled the number of movies that were being nominated for Best Picture. It can be up to 10. It's sometimes it's 9, sometimes it's 8. They get to decide.
Correct.
Whereas it used to be 5 all the time. So
wouldn't that make your percentages even worse?
Yeah, there are a lot more movies though. I mean, Sush is right. There's like many, many more movies that are being released now than there were
1975.
In 1975. Like,
should we have a nomination process that nominates as a percentage? The number of nominations open is a percentage of the total number of movies made every year.
Yeah, it should have some percentile calculation in there, because
that's the way to run the Oscars.
Yeah, that'll get more viewers. Make it more analytical.
If you can't chase after the awards, maybe there's some insider value that the people who are producing movies want to work with you. Maybe there are some fans who might see, oh, this production studio like an A24 consistently makes movies. I'm excited for the next one. But that kind of value is a little bit lost. If I'm a studio and I'm trying to get the biggest box office revenue, if awards don't matter, do we know what the things are that do?
So there's actually been a long history of economists studying this question, trying to, come up with models that'll help predict box office revenues of films, trying to connect them to sort of the quantifiable characteristics of a film and say, well, these are the 5 things that really make an impact, right? So the one that's studied the most actually is, and this is now, it tells you that we're talking about a time that has passed, but the one that's been studied the most is reviews, critics' reviews, and the impact of critics' reviews on a movie's, financial success. So there are a lot of studies that have looked into that. The results kind of go, in different directions. But back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there were a few critics whose reviews really held sway and could be used as, independent variables in a regression where the dependent variable is the box office revenue.
So it sounds like you're talking about Broadway plays or something. That's how that sounds, right? Because it's
the critics are tearing us apart.
I know. It's harder to imagine right now that like, who are the big movie reviewers of this generation?
I mean, it's almost a truism that if the reviewers really like it, the audience hates it and the movie does poorly, or vice versa. The critics hate it, the audience loves it, and then it makes a ton of money.
I think that kind of a split this is just a feeling I have. I don't have the numbers for it, but that split between these critics and the audiences and what they like, that is more maybe something that's more recent. But I think back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, people did pick up the newspaper and they did have their favorite critic at the New York Times or at, Chicago Tribune or whatever it was, and decide whether they want to go watch a movie that weekend based on what they read. And
well, the fact of newspapers, people reading, those sound amazing to me. Also, trusting experts, right? I mean,
right.
Somebody whose judgment you respect.
Exactly. You hit upon all the issues. I mean, so society has changed, but I think also technology has changed. And so that is one thing to put on hold is the fact that, reviews and critics don't matter as much today. Another reason is because of the change in technology, everyone has an opinion now. And there's, people care less about that one person who had the most important voice because, everybody supposedly has a voice now and has something to say. So anyway, reviews are one. The other thing that people that have studied, that economists have studied, quantifiable variable that may have an impact is star power. So economists have used many different methods to try to quantify star power. I've seen some papers where they're talking about giving like a number to each actor involved in the film, and the number has a lot of things that feed into it. such as that person's, career box office, their last year's box office, of the movies that they were associated with, and the awards that they may have won. All of those things sort of feed into this sort of star meter, and then that would be used as a variable.
Do they ever put it in a variable like a lagged variable for how many times this person's been a huge box office draw? Because I feel like that's got to be negative when people see certain celebrities who they've seen too much and they just feel sick of them, and that's actually harmful.
I mean,
for example, who?
Yeah, I was going to say who.
Listen, Jennifer Lawrence and Chris Pratt seem like two people who socially, for whatever reason, overstayed their welcome, and suddenly people turned on them. I don't know at what point that happened, but it's almost like for some celebrities, there's an oversaturation kind of thing.
I mean, I think that may have less to do with the fact that their star meter is that high and more to do with sort of individual, characteristics of those people that you're
Sure.
talking about. But I think, if you look at just, for instance, somebody like a Tom Cruise, right? I mean, this guy is doing better and better over the years. And you would think that people would be tired of seeing the same thing, Mission Impossible 6 or whatever's on now, right? But each one does better than the previous one.
Dead Reckoning Part 2.
Yeah. Isn't it? It has some other name, right, though? Because they have Dead Reckoning Part 1, and then this one's just a completely different name.
Could be.
Yeah. Harrison Ford is still drawing audiences in his 80s, right?
I don't think you could really rely on this, but Harrison Ford, I think, brings to mind the fact that Tom Selleck was the first choice for Indiana Jones. You know that story? But then he was too busy with Magnum PI.
Good choice.
So they chose Harrison Ford. And so the thing that I'm wondering is, like, in those kind of circumstances where there was some sort of exogenous shock, which that's not really in that case of Magnum PI, but something happens, a person is unable to be in that movie, and to see how much the movie made relative to expectations because they didn't have it. Because I think there's a lot of these omitted factors that would be correlated with, like, the presence of some of these big stars in the movies. They have star power, and they're drawn to these movies that are going to be successful, but is that really an independent? In fact, and you wonder, like, if we didn't have this person in the role and it was replaced by some or next best choice, how much less would the movie make? I'm wondering.
We should film movies with two different actors in the lead role and release them
randomized
in two different
trials.
countries.
Exactly.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
Half the odd number of theaters they have Harrison Ford, even number they have Tom Selleck. Let's see which one does better.
I think that's coming to theaters soon with AI. I mean, you're going to have neither of them is actually going to be acting in it, but you'll just have two versions.
They actually did that with the movie Clue, where they filmed multiple different endings and released them in different theaters. It's a shame that we didn't do any statistical testing on that at the time to see what kind of ending people like the most.
But, presumably this economic study where the star and their quantifiable star meter is an independent variable, that's really what they're trying to get at, right? They're trying to say, well, Tom Selleck's, got a 525 and Harrison Ford's got an X, 620 or whatever. So it tells you he's going to do better. And that's kind of what you're trying to get at with all of these analyses. And I actually wanted to add one thing, which is that omitted variable bias that you were talking about. Especially comes into play in the studies that look at the impact of reviews on box office, because both reviews and box office themselves are affected presumably by the quality of the film. So that's the thing that's actually missing. They're both actually correlated for a reason. But yeah, so there's that. So there's box office. There's reviews, there's stars. And then there are other factors that have been studied by these economists. One of them is whether it's a sequel or a remake, whether it's part of a franchise. And now there's a whole world, apparently, of economic analyses that are being done on box office that use big data. Now, I'm not exactly sure what they're doing specifically.
I think when people say big data, they just mean more data.
They just mean more data.
Just a lot more data.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of studies, basically, to sum it up, of where they're trying to predict what would give you high returns on a film, but it is a very subjective field, obviously, by its nature, and very difficult to make predictions about any particular project.
Sush, and when I was looking at the data on the box office, what was really surprising to me is how much, for a lot of the top movies, how much they make in those first couple weeks, the first weekend. It's
Right.
phenomenal. This idea that it's a part of a franchise, it's an anticipated sequel to something. I think when you look at the data, you see there's some movies that are like that, and they're just like right out of the gate, they've made a ton of money. And then there are other ones, and you had talked about them, Parasite and others, where it's word of mouth. It takes a while. But I think the really successful movies, when I've looked at the data, they're the ones where they do well in those first couple of weeks because there's such anticipation for them. I'm sure they spent a lot marketing them. Now, that doesn't mean they will always, some of them get crushed at the box office and they didn't expect that. And then it's a very bad sign because it's very hard to it didn't go well in the first couple of weeks, but it's going to turn around. So I do think that being part of some larger franchise has got to be a huge part of this.
Yeah, I mean, there's no other industry like it in terms of the economics of it. If you think about the fact that when a movie is released, especially when it has a wide release, you're talking about several hundred theaters in the country that it goes out to simultaneously. And those theaters, you're competing for the time of those theaters. If those theaters can find the very next week something else that will be a better draw on their screens, for ticket seats, they're going to do it. And so that's why that first week matters so much for a film, is to sort of set the tone for the theater to say, look, we did this well last week. Don't kick us out the next week. Don't kick us out the following week. And it's really a battle to stay alive week after week for these films, which is why the very first week, like out of the gate, matters so much. Because if you didn't meet the expectations, you've already opened, you picked the number of theaters you're going to open at. That's all part of this math that you're doing to try to figure out, you have an expectation of how well you're going to do. And if you don't meet that expectation, then the theater numbers start to kick you out, basically.
And it kind of also matters when during the year you're released, because there are certain times when people, for whatever reason, are looking to go to these big movies, whether it's Memorial Day weekend or 4th of July or going into the holiday season. But I'm not sure this time of year right now that we're recording in March is really a big time for movie releases. And so I'm sure there's also negotiation about when are we going to be released so that we can have that biggest initial splash.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think I remember reading somewhere that the whole idea of the big summer movie, it didn't really exist until Jaws.
Yeah.
Jaws came around, blew everybody's minds. And then this whole idea of, this is when people go to the movies. Let's create the big summer movie every year. That's when it began.
So all the things that you've talked about so far and trying to value different components and how they might result in a bigger box office revenue, are all those kind of quaint now? It feels like the industry has changed so dramatically with streaming services. Is there any way we can evaluate what is an award worth? What is star power worth given Netflix's whole business model, or Amazon?
Yeah. I mean, there's been obviously, all of this stuff, any conversation about box office and reviews and all of that is definitely to some degree quaint because of the world we live in now, which is completely changed. And with the advent of streaming, which, we're talking about the last 10, 12 years now, completely changed the viewing habits of everybody in the world, really. So yeah, there's, I think the studios and economists, everybody has sort of scrambled over the last few years to try to understand and redefine this industry. Just to give you some statistics, I have some here. Netflix's revenues went from, in 2011, from 3 billion to now 33 billion in 2023. The number of subscribers worldwide went from 30 million in 2011 to nearly 260 million in 2023. It's sort of plateauing now, for obvious reasons, because there's only so many people in the world, and also because they have finally got a lot of competition from other platforms. but it has been a sea change, obviously, in the industry. And so now the metrics of interest are very different than what they were in just 20 years ago, right? No one is just talking about box office because movies are making their money elsewhere. They're making their money through sales to these platforms, right? And no longer are you paying for a view, right? You have a subscription, so you're not, every time you watch a movie, you're not paying for it, and so that is a big change as well. So
you might also be supplementing your subscription with ads if you've got a lower tier subscription on any of those services.
Right. Yeah, you might pay through the viewing of ads, but it's an indirect kind of payment, right? It's just with your time or whatever. And so, yeah, the way that revenue is collected has changed, and its relationship to individual films has changed dramatically. So in the past, you could tell right away whether a movie did well or not by just simply looking at the box office. How many people sat in the theater to watch it? Now, that's harder to. It's monetary success is less connected to just the individual film, because a film may release on a particular platform and people may watch it not necessarily because that film was the reason that that they are watching it, but because they already have that platform, they already have a subscription to Apple TV or whatever it is, and so if the movie comes out on Apple TV, they'll watch it for free. That's a very different numerical world that you're living in now. And so the metric of interest has moved from being box office revenues to some measure of eyeballs and minutes spent by eyeballs. That's a way that you can sort of judge better now whether a film is actually successful or not.
Yeah, I think the subscriber model is interesting because the way I see it, if I'm looking at the Oscar nominations and I'm thinking about why is it that I see more streaming platforms getting their movies to all these different awards, that for them is like another form of advertising. It's another way of pulling in a subscriber base.
Absolutely.
You're adding to the pile that you've got of like, hey, here's our horde of movies and TV shows. The thing that's frustrating about it is that we don't have any data about any of those things.
Well, so a couple of things you said there. One thing that actually I remember during the Oscars watching them was that the Netflix was actually mentioned. If you go back and watch the Oscars, I think there's at least 2 or 3 Netflix movies there, and they would say the word Netflix, like when they're talking about it, which is like massive advertising, right? Because you've got this huge audience that's watching it. I'm not as big as it used to be, but still. So yeah, there's not just the cachet, but just like straight free publicity that you're getting. And it also tells you how much the world has changed, that like now we're talking about Netflix films at the Oscars. The second thing that you said which was, how do we know? Like, do we have the data to tell us whether a movie's doing well on streaming?
Yeah.
And so, yes, the answer to that is just like how there is Nielsen ratings for television shows, there is now something called the Nielsen Streaming Top 10 that's published every week. You can actually go online and look at it. It's kind of amazing. And I looked for randomly, I think I looked at January 6th, that week, from the 6th to the 12th of 2025. And the number one watched thing on Nielsen Streaming Top 10 was Squid Game. Far and away. It had 2,365, so 2.3 billion minutes next to it. I'm assuming they have some way of scaling up from the households that they have this thing installed in. The number 2 was Landman, which was a surprise to me. That's 1.3 billion minutes. So
I like Landman.
This kind of, yeah. It's funny. Like I think like Landman is one of those shows that economists actually like. Jesse is another one who loves it. So I've heard that a lot. I'm gonna have to go watch it. But yeah, the idea of how do you monitor success, that's happening already, because this is such a industry based on, if you can't tell whether a movie's doing well, how do you pay it?
Just to interrupt there a little bit, do we think we should be more likely to watch something because economists suggest that we should watch it? Jesse and Steve, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think if Jesse and I agree on it, I think it's a winner. You know,
Yeah.
That's the old school 2 thumbs up.
one of the we could have our own show like Siskel and Ebert. The one of the things I wonder about is that decades ago, my old dissertation advisor Sherwin Rosen came up with this economics of superstars uh, idea, and arguing that the technology that allowed performing artists to compete using the technology that made their performance not quite the same as a live performance, but pretty good, would cause the income of these performers to be more skewed because it doesn't take as many performers to entertain. As like back in the day, go back a couple hundred years, if you wanted to see a performance, you had to go see a live play or concert. And now there's so many different ways of watching it. I wonder if, because there's a part of this that says it seems more opportunities for people because there's so many different ways. You don't have to get the studio to back your project. It'll be maybe on YouTube or it'll be on something else, and then eventually it could
Quibi.
be streaming. Yeah, and so all those free streaming things, and so I wonder what effect it has on the compensation. Is it becoming more democratized, or is there even more like, the big superstars are making even more and more because they're landing the big deals on some of the streaming? I think it's kind of an interesting thing because to me it seems a little bit like, and from your perspective, Sush, as a movie maker, like it's got to be easier than it used to be to get something out there, and it's like a lottery ticket, but maybe it'll pay out, and that might be easier now than it was before. So maybe the concentration of who's making the money might be being spread out a little bit more now that we have a lot more ways to view a movie.
So, as someone who has made an independent film and been in that world trying to sell it to digital platforms and so on, that what you're talking about is the central question that independent filmmakers talk about every day, in Hollywood, which is, oh, we have all of these platforms which were not available before. You can actually put your film on one of those platforms, and even make it if you can't do a subscriber video on demand, you can do what's known as transactional video on demand, where people can pay, $3.99 and watch your film. It's out there, but the challenge still remains that you're still competing for the same eyeballs. And if you go up against Squid Game on Netflix, and maybe you're on the Netflix library or you're on Amazon Prime, but there is only so much time that people have, right? So the challenge still remains. Yes, it is now available, whereas before you would never have made it through the gatekeepers that take you to the theatrical release. Now you have these other avenues, but you're still dealing with the same issues, and the eyeballs per the eyeball minutes thing is still restrictive. So, and somebody else like a studio has the resources to advertise the heck out of their film, and the independent filmmaker, what are they going to do? Put it on Facebook?
Yeah, that problem's got to be pretty difficult. That previously movies were in competition with other movies, but now on streaming platforms, they're in competition with people's favorite TV shows or the entire panoply of what television exists as right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so films were always in competition, I think, with TV shows, even back in the day, because you always had shows that you could watch instead.
Or other things you could do.
Yeah. So now there are just so many other things you can do, right? Because the eyeballs are, you just have to walk out on the street and you'll see everybody walking the street looking at their phone. So that eyeball time is already going somewhere else where it didn't before. There's just so many other things that you can do, just social media, whatever, scrolling on TikTok or whatever. So now you're competing with things technologically that just didn't exist before. So those are the things pulling away from independent film, which is why I actually think that there has been a decline. The heyday of independent cinema, at least according to people in the film industry, is widely considered to be in the 90s. The time when Tarantino came out of nowhere, and like all of these filmmakers that just so people were going to the theaters to watch them, and people don't really know the names of independent filmmakers anymore. And that's
just
not
like
a coincidence.
the TV shows are competing with like Seinfeld reruns or whatever that are out there. They have all these movies that are at your fingertips on these different streaming services from the last however many decades. And so you come up with a new thing, and it's like not only do you have to compete with everything else that was released in 2025, you've got this eyeball minutes that could be allocated to things that were from, hey, I'm going to go watch this movie. I haven't seen it in 20 years. When you said Jaws, it's like, yeah, that's a great movie. You should watch that.
Are these streaming services voluntarily providing these Nielsen numbers? We do know from producers of hit TV shows that they had no idea that their show was successful on blank streaming service because they didn't get to see any of the underlying numbers about how well their show was doing.
Yeah, so I don't know what exactly went on there, but what I do know is that Nielsen's collecting this data from 40,000 U.S. households that are part of its national TV panel, and the data comes from basically smart TVs. So now I imagine that you wouldn't be able to get the data if the streamers were refusing to cooperate.
Yeah.
So they must be cooperating. I think they themselves probably want to know what their competitors are doing as well. So it's a way that basically everybody in the industry kind of
gets a sample of other people's information without releasing all of your underlying.
Exactly.
Hey, the average person watched Bridgerton for 3 hours and 20 minutes or whatever the specific data, the micro data they might have.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Sush,
that sounds like collusion.
Sush, let me get this right. They're watching us through the smart TVs.
They're watching everything you do. Exactly.
And they don't like the episode they're watching, Steve. Well, to me, it seems like maybe the awards are important, but now it's much less clear about the value because our box office revenue is less clearly the most important thing. Everything is now subscriber based.
It is super fascinating. I mean, what's going to happen in the future? Because the interesting decision that the decision that studios used to make in the old days when they're trying to make a movie was to just look at this one variable of interest, which was box office, right? And now what they have to look at is, well, we make this movie, we're going to put it on our platform. What is it going to do to our subscriber base? And is that effect even direct? Is it going to take it from 31 million to 31.5 million because people want to watch this movie? Or is it going to have an imperceptible effect? And so that decision making from the point of view of the studios has changed dramatically. So who knows, maybe awards will actually become more important. I don't know.
Well, I guess we'll have to find out. We'll keep our eyes peeled. Thank you very much for talking with us today, Sush.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers, Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.